Welcome to Divine Bible Stories. As you close your eyes and prepare to drift into peaceful slumber, let us guide you through the timeless tales of the Bible. Join us on a journey of faith, wisdom, and tranquility. Each night, we'll delve into a different story, inviting you to immerse yourself in the ancient narratives that have inspired hearts for generations. Relax, let go, and allow the soothing words to lead you into a restful sleep. If you find solace and inspiration in our content, we kindly ask you to show your support by liking and subscribing to our channel. By doing so, you'll stay connected with us on this sacred journey. Thank you for choosing Divine Bible Stories as your companion for bedtime storytelling. May these stories guide you to peaceful dreams and a refreshed spirit. Now let the whispers of the past carry you into a serene slumber. Oppression and the birth of Moses. The descendants of Jacob, also known as the Israelites, had come to Egypt with Jacob and his sons. Over time, Joseph and his brothers passed away, along with that entire generation. Meanwhile, the Israelites continued to multiply and grow in number, becoming exceedingly numerous in Egypt. However, a new Pharaoh came into power who did not have the same regard for Joseph's contributions. This Pharaoh saw the Israelites' increasing population as a potential threat. He feared that if they became too numerous and joined enemies in a conflict, they might leave Egypt. To address this perceived threat, Pharaoh decided to oppress the Israelites. He appointed slave masters to enforce forced labor upon them and had them build the cities of Pithom and Rameses as store cities for his benefit. Despite the harsh treatment and oppression, the Israelites continued to multiply and spread throughout Egypt, which caused the Egyptians to dread them even more. The oppression intensified as the Egyptians subjected the Israelites to grueling labor involving brickmaking, construction, and various agricultural tasks. The Israelites' lives were made bitterly difficult, and they endured ruthless treatment. Pharaoh's next step was to command the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to kill every newborn Hebrew boy. This was a deliberate attempt to control the Israelite population growth. However, these midwives chose to obey God rather than the Pharaoh's command. They allowed the boys to live, leading to a conversation between Pharaoh and the midwives. When questioned, the midwives cleverly claimed that Hebrew women gave birth quickly, often before they could arrive. Because the midwives feared God and acted righteously, God blessed them, and their own families multiplied. As a result, the Israelite population continued to grow despite Pharaoh's attempts to control it. Pharaoh's response to the midwives' disobedience was to issue a new and more ruthless order. Every Hebrew boy born should be thrown into the Nile River, while the girls should be allowed to live. This marked the beginning of a period of severe oppression and cruelty against the Israelites, as Pharaoh sought to reduce their numbers and exert control over their population. The birth of Moses and his early life. A man from the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that the child was healthy and strong, she hid him for 3 months to protect him from Pharaoh's order to kill Hebrew baby boys. However, she could not conceal him forever. So she made a papyrus basket, coated it with tar and pitch, and placed the baby in it. She then set the basket among the reeds by the bank of the Nile River. The baby's sister kept watch from a distance to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter came to the Nile to bathe, accompanied by her attendants. She spotted the basket among the reeds and sent her servant to fetch it. Upon opening the basket, she saw the crying baby and felt compassion for him. Recognizing that he was a Hebrew child, she decided to adopt him as her own. The baby's sister, seizing the opportunity, offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and the baby's own mother was summoned. Pharaoh's daughter entrusted the baby to his mother's care, paying her to nurse and care for him. When the child grew older, he was taken back to Pharaoh's daughter and became her adopted son. She named him Moses, signifying that she had drawn him out of the water, a reference to his rescue from the Nile. Moses' flight to Midian. As Moses grew up, He observed the hardships endured by his fellow Hebrews under the Egyptian oppression. One day, he witnessed an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. In a moment of anger, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. The next day, when he tried to intervene in a dispute between two Hebrews, one of them confronted him about the previous incident. Fearful that his actions had been discovered, Moses realized he needed to flee for his life. Word reached Pharaoh about Moses' actions, and he sought to kill him. Moses fled Egypt and journeyed to the land of Midian, where he settled by a well. There he encountered the 7 daughters of a priest named Reuel, who were struggling to water their father's flock due to the harassment of other shepherds. Moses came to their aid, protecting them and helping them water their flock. The girls returned home early to their father, and he asked them about their swift return. They told him of the Egyptian man who had aided them. Reuel instructed his daughters to invite the man for a meal, and Moses agreed to stay with them. He eventually married Reuel's daughter Zipporah. She bore Moses a son named Gershom, a name that reflected Moses' status as a stranger in a foreign land. During this time, the king of Egypt, who had ordered the oppression of the Israelites, died. The Israelites' suffering and cries for help in their bondage reached God's ears. God remembered the covenant he had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In response, God looked upon the Israelites and took notice of their plight, showing his concern for their well-being. This marked the beginning of God's intervention in the story of Moses and the eventual liberation of the Israelites from their oppression in Egypt. Moses and the burning bush. Moses had settled into his new life in Midian, where he tended the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro, a priest of Midian. One day, he led the flock to Horeb, a mountain also known as the Mountain of God. There, an astonishing sight confronted him. A bush was ablaze with flames of fire, yet it remained unconsumed by the fire. Intrigued, Moses decided to investigate this phenomenon more closely. As Moses approached the burning bush, God called out to him by name, saying, "Moses, Moses!" Moses replied, "Here I am." God instructed him to remove his sandals because he was standing on holy ground. God then identified himself as the God of Moses' forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In awe and reverence, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to gaze upon God. God revealed his awareness of the suffering of the Israelites in Egypt, oppressed by their taskmasters. He expressed concern for their plight and declared his intention to rescue them from Egypt, leading them to a land rich in resources, a land flowing with milk and honey, the territory of various tribes, including the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. God's plan was to send Moses to Pharaoh, charging him with the task of liberating the Israelites from their bondage in Egypt. Moses, however, felt overwhelmed by this responsibility and questioned his own worthiness and qualifications to lead such a monumental endeavor. God reassured Moses by promising his presence and guidance, assuring that the Israelites would worship God on the very mountain where the burning bush encounter took place once their liberation was achieved. Moses inquired about the name of the God who was sending him. God's response, "I am who I am," conveyed his eternal, self-existent nature. He instructed Moses to inform the Israelites that "I am" had sent him. Furthermore, God instructed Moses to gather the elders of Israel and deliver a message. He was to inform them that the God of their forefathers had appeared to him and had seen the suffering of the Israelites. God intended to bring them out of Egypt and into the promised land, a land filled with abundance. Moses was to present this message to the elders and to go to the king of Egypt, requesting a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to God. God foresaw that Pharaoh would not willingly release the Israelites, so he pledged to perform miraculous signs and wonders in Egypt to demonstrate his power. These wonders would ultimately compel Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Additionally, God revealed his plan to make the Egyptians well-disposed toward the Israelites, resulting in the Israelites leaving Egypt with gifts of silver, gold, and clothing that they would receive from their Egyptian neighbors. In this encounter at the burning bush, Moses received his divine commission to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, setting in motion the events that would culminate in their liberation and journey to the Promised Land. Signs for Moses. Moses expressed his concerns to God about the credibility of his mission. He worried that the Israelites might not believe him or listen to him when he tells them that the God of their forefathers had appeared to him. In response, God provided Moses with 3 signs to authenticate his message and confirm his divine calling. The first sign involved Moses' staff. God instructed him to throw it on the ground, and when he did, it transformed into a snake. Moses, startled, fled from the snake. God then told him to reach out and take the snake by its tail, and it turned back into his staff. This demonstration of divine power was intended to convince the Israelites that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had truly appeared to Moses. The second sign involved Moses' hand. God instructed him to put his hand inside his cloak, and when he pulled it out, it was afflicted with leprosy, appearing white as snow. Upon returning his hand to his cloak, it was restored to health. This sign served to further reinforce God's authority and presence. Still apprehensive, Moses raised concerns about his ability to speak effectively. He mentioned his slowness of speech and tongue. God responded by reminding Moses that he was the one who created speech and was fully capable of helping him communicate. God assured Moses that he would provide the words and guide his speech. Moses, however, persisted in his hesitations and requested that God send someone else in his place. This reluctance angered God, but he suggested involving Moses' brother Aaron as a spokesperson. God acknowledged that Aaron could speak well and would be glad to assist Moses. God informed Moses that he would put words in both Moses' and Aaron's mouths, and that Aaron would convey God's message to the people as if Moses were God himself. With this solution in place, God instructed Moses to take his staff, the symbol of divine power, and return to Egypt to perform the signs before Pharaoh. Despite the wonders Moses would perform, God indicated that he would harden Pharaoh's heart, preventing him from releasing the Israelites. The confrontation with Pharaoh would ultimately lead to the fulfillment of God's promise to liberate his people. Moses then returned to his father-in-law Jethro to seek permission to leave Midian and visit his people in Egypt. Jethro granted his request, and Moses, accompanied by his wife and sons, embarked on the journey back to Egypt, taking with him the staff of God. The narrative continues with Moses' encounter with Pharaoh and the subsequent series of plagues that would unfold as a result of Pharaoh's hardened heart, all ultimately leading to the Israelites' liberation from slavery and their journey toward the Promised Land. Bricks without straw. Moses and Aaron approached Pharaoh once again, conveying the message from the Lord. "Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." However, Pharaoh responded with defiance, questioning the authority of the Lord and refusing to release the Israelites. He declared that he did not know the Lord and would not obey his command. Moses and Aaron explained that the God of the Hebrews had met with them and requested a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to him. They warned that failing to comply might lead to plagues or even the sword. Nonetheless, Pharaoh accused them of interfering with the people's labor, arguing that the Israelites were numerous and stopping their work would be detrimental. In response, Pharaoh issued a harsh command to the slave drivers and overseers, ordering them to stop supplying straw to the Israelites for making bricks. Instead, the Israelites were instructed to gather their own straw while still being required to produce the same number of bricks as before. Pharaoh accused them of being lazy and using the desire to sacrifice to their God as an excuse to shirk their labor. The Israelites were put in a difficult situation. They were now tasked with finding their own straw while maintaining the same brick production quota. The slave drivers continued to press them and subjected them to physical abuse. The Israelite overseers, who were responsible for supervising the labor, approached Pharaoh to plead their case, explaining that their inability to meet the quota was due to the lack of straw. Pharaoh dismissed their plea, accusing them of laziness and demanding they work harder. The Israelite overseers were frustrated and felt trapped. They were caught between the harsh demands of Pharaoh and the expectations of their own people. When they encountered Moses and Aaron, they expressed their anger and despair, blaming them for making them obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials, putting their lives at risk. Moses, in turn, turned to God with his own frustration and confusion. He questioned why God had allowed trouble to befall the Israelites after he had gone to Pharaoh to speak in his name. He felt that since his initial encounter with Pharaoh, things had only worsened, and God had not yet delivered his people. This section of the story highlights the escalating conflict between Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh, as well as the increasing hardships faced by the Israelites. It sets the stage for the dramatic events that will follow, including the eventual plagues and the Israelites' eventual liberation from Egypt. God's promise and Moses' concerns. The Lord reassured Moses that he would witness the might of God's hand as he confronted Pharaoh. The Lord declared that Pharaoh would eventually allow the Israelites to go free, driven out by the power of God's mighty hand. God further revealed his identity to Moses, stating that he had appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but had not fully revealed himself by his name, the Lord. He reminded Moses of his covenant with them, promising them the land of Canaan. God emphasized that he had heard the cries of the enslaved Israelites and remembered his covenant with them. God instructed Moses to convey his message to the Israelites, that he would bring them out from under the yoke of the Egyptians, free them from slavery, redeem them with mighty acts of judgment, and lead them to the promised land. He would claim them as his people, and they would know him as their God. This message emphasized God's commitment to delivering his people and fulfilling his covenant. Moses shared this divine message with the Israelites, but they did not heed his words due to their discouragement and the weight of their harsh labor. The Lord then commanded Moses to approach Pharaoh again, instructing him to demand the release of the Israelites from Egypt. Moses, however, expressed his concerns that if his own people were not listening to him, why would Pharaoh listen, especially since Moses considered himself to have difficulty speaking? The passage also provides a record of Moses and Aaron's lineage and their connection to the Levites. The names and clans of Moses' and Aaron's families are listed, highlighting their ancestry. The Lord's command to bring the Israelites out of Egypt was given directly to Aaron and Moses. The passage underscores Moses' insecurities and reluctance, despite God's clear guidance and promises. Moses' hesitation and doubt were central to his character as a reluctant leader, but they also highlight his reliance on God's strength rather than his own. This sets the stage for the upcoming negotiations and confrontations with Pharaoh as the narrative continues. Confrontation with Pharaoh and the first plague. The Lord assured Moses that he had made him like God to Pharaoh, with Aaron acting as his prophet. God reiterated his plan. Moses was to relay God's commands, and Aaron was to speak to Pharaoh, urging him to release the Israelites. However, God also forewarned Moses that he would harden Pharaoh's heart, causing him to resist despite the signs and wonders that God would perform. God explained that Pharaoh's stubbornness would lead to a series of mighty acts of judgment on Egypt, culminating in the release of the Israelites. These acts of judgment were intended to demonstrate the Lord's power and to make both the Israelites and the Egyptians aware of his authority. Moses and Aaron, now in their 80s, obeyed God's instructions and confronted Pharaoh. Aaron's staff, when thrown down, transformed into a snake. Astonishingly, Pharaoh's wise men, sorcerers, and magicians replicated this feat through their secret arts. However, Aaron's snake consumed the snakes created by the Egyptian magicians, showcasing God's supremacy. Pharaoh's heart remained obstinate, as God had foretold. This marked the beginning of a series of plagues designed to persuade Pharaoh to release the Israelites. The first plague was the turning of the Nile River's water into blood. God instructed Moses and Aaron to meet Pharaoh by the Nile, and Aaron was to strike the water with his staff. The waters of the Nile instantly transformed into blood, resulting in the death of the fish and the foul smell of the river. This plague affected all of Egypt, making its waters undrinkable and emphasizing the power of the Lord. Despite the striking evidence of God's might, the Egyptian magicians managed to replicate the turning of water into blood through their secret arts, further hardening Pharaoh's heart. In desperation, the Egyptians dug for water along the Nile, seeking a source of drinkable water. This event marked the beginning of the plagues that would escalate as God's attempts to soften Pharaoh's heart and secure the Israelites' freedom became increasingly severe. The plagues of frogs, gnats, and flies. The plague of frogs. God instructed Moses to go to Pharaoh again and demand the release of the Israelites. If Pharaoh refused, God would send a plague of frogs upon Egypt. These frogs would infest the land, entering homes, beds, ovens, and kneading troughs. Moses relayed the message, and Aaron stretched out his staff, causing frogs to swarm the land. Even the magicians managed to produce frogs through their secret arts. Pharaoh, plagued by the frogs, summoned Moses and Aaron and begged them to pray for their removal, promising to release the Israelites in exchange. Moses allowed Pharaoh to set the time for their removal, and Pharaoh requested that the frogs be gone by the next day. Moses granted his request, and the frogs died, causing a terrible stench throughout the land. Despite this, Pharaoh reneged on his promise and hardened his heart, refusing to listen to Moses and Aaron. The plague of gnats. God instructed Moses and Aaron to strike the dust of the ground with Aaron's staff, resulting in a plague of gnats that affected both people and animals throughout Egypt. The magicians attempted to replicate the gnats but failed. Even the magicians acknowledged that this was the work of God. However, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he did not heed the warning. The plague of flies. God instructed Moses to confront Pharaoh again, warning that if he didn't release the Israelites, swarms of flies would infest Egypt, filling houses and covering the ground. However, God declared that the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, would be spared from this plague. The next day, swarms of flies indeed invaded Egypt, causing havoc. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, suggesting that they could offer sacrifices to God in Egypt. Moses rejected this offer, explaining that the Egyptians would detest their sacrifices and might even harm them. Instead, Moses insisted on a 3-day journey into the wilderness to worship God as God had commanded. Pharaoh agreed to allow them to worship, but wanted them to remain nearby. Moses agreed to pray for the flies' removal, but warned Pharaoh not to deceive them again. Moses prayed, and God removed the flies from Egypt. However, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he did not release the Israelites. These plagues were not only displays of God's power, but also opportunities for Pharaoh to acknowledge God's authority and release the Israelites. Yet, Pharaoh's continued stubbornness led to more afflictions for Egypt. The plague on livestock. Moses and Aaron once again confronted Pharaoh with God's message to let the Israelites go. If he refused, a plague on the livestock of Egypt would occur, affecting horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats. However, God would make a distinction, and no animals belonging to the Israelites would die. The next day, this prophecy came true. Livestock throughout Egypt died, while those of the Israelites remained unharmed. Pharaoh verified this, yet his heart remained unyielding. The plague of boils. God instructed Moses and Aaron to take soot from a furnace and toss it into the air. As they did so, festering boils broke out on people and animals throughout Egypt, even afflicting the magicians. Despite this, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he did not heed Moses and Aaron's warning. The plague of hail. God instructed Moses to warn Pharaoh of a forthcoming hailstorm of unprecedented severity. Moses informed Pharaoh that all people and animals outside without shelter would be struck by the hail, and it would be disastrous. Those who feared God's word heeded the warning and brought their possessions to safety. Moses stretched out his hand, and a severe hailstorm, accompanied by thunder and lightning, struck Egypt. This hailstorm ravaged the land, destroying crops and trees, and even killing people and animals. Yet, the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was untouched. Faced with the catastrophic consequences of the hailstorm, Pharaoh admitted his wrongdoing and asked Moses to pray to God for relief. Moses agreed, and the hail and thunder ceased. However, even after this display of God's power, Pharaoh's heart remained stubborn, and he did not release the Israelites. These plagues continued to escalate in intensity, yet Pharaoh persisted in his refusal to release the Israelites, even after acknowledging his wrongdoing and seeking relief from the plagues. The plague of locusts. God informed Moses that he had deliberately hardened Pharaoh's heart and the hearts of his officials in order to perform these signs and display his power. Moses and Aaron returned to Pharaoh, warning him that unless he released the Israelites, a plague of locusts would strike the next day. The locusts would devour everything left after the hail, including crops and trees. Pharaoh's officials urged him to let the people go to avoid further ruin, but Pharaoh only permitted the men to go, excluding the women and children. Moses stretched out his hand, and a swarm of locusts plagued Egypt. They covered the land and consumed every green thing. Pharaoh's resistance wavered in the face of the devastation, and he admitted his wrongdoing, asking Moses to pray for the removal of the locusts. Moses did so, and a strong west wind carried the locusts away into the Red Sea. However, despite acknowledging his sins and seeking relief, Pharaoh's heart was once again hardened by God, and he refused to release the Israelites. The plague of darkness. God instructed Moses to stretch out his hand towards the sky, resulting in a darkness that could be felt enveloping Egypt for 3 days. This darkness was so dense that no one could see anyone else or move around during that time. However, the Israelites had light in their dwellings. Pharaoh summoned Moses and permitted the Israelites to go worship, including women and children, but only if they left their flocks and herds behind. Moses insisted that they needed their livestock for sacrifices and worship, and until they reached their destination, they wouldn't know what animals were needed. Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he became increasingly defiant, threatening Moses with death if he appeared before him again. Moses agreed and vowed not to appear before Pharaoh again. The plague on the firstborn. God informed Moses that he would bring one final plague upon Pharaoh and Egypt, after which Pharaoh would not only allow the Israelites to leave, but also drive them out completely. Moses was instructed to tell the Israelites, both men and women, to ask their Egyptian neighbors for articles of silver and gold. Interestingly, God had made the Egyptians view the Israelites with favor, and Moses himself was highly regarded among Pharaoh's officials and the people of Egypt. Moses conveyed God's message to Pharaoh, explaining that around midnight, the firstborn sons of Egypt, from the highest to the lowest positions, would die. This would include even the firstborn of cattle. The ensuing wailing and mourning would be unprecedented in its intensity. However, among the Israelites, there would be no loss, signifying God's distinction between Egypt and Israel. Moses foretold that Pharaoh's own officials would come to Moses, acknowledging the power of God and urging the Israelites to leave. The chapter concludes by emphasizing that although Moses and Aaron performed all these signs and wonders before Pharaoh, his heart remained hardened by God, and he still refused to let the Israelites go. God had already foreseen that Pharaoh would not listen, as his intention was to multiply his wonders in Egypt, demonstrating his power even more vividly. The Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. God instructed Moses and Aaron regarding the observance of the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. This month marked the beginning of the Israelites' year, and on the 10th day, each household was to select a lamb without defect. If a household was too small for a lamb, they were to share it with their neighbors. The lambs were to be kept until the 14th day of the month, and then slaughtered at twilight. The Israelites were to take some of the lamb's blood and put it on the door frames of their houses. They were to roast and eat the lamb along with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. No part of the lamb was to be left until morning. This meal was to be eaten with haste, as it symbolized the Lord's Passover. On that same night, God would pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, human and animal. But the blood on the door frames would be a sign, and he would pass over those houses, sparing them from the destructive plague. Moses instructed the elders of Israel to select and slaughter the Passover lamb. The blood was to be put on the doorframe, and the people were to stay inside their homes until morning. As God went through Egypt, he saw the blood and spared the Israelites' houses from the plague. God declared that this day would be commemorated as a lasting ordinance. For 7 days, the Israelites were to eat unleavened bread and remove all yeast from their houses. On the 1st and 7th days, there were to be sacred assemblies, during which no work was to be done except the preparation of food. The festival of unleavened bread was a way to remember how God brought them out of Egypt. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from Pharaoh's firstborn to those of prisoners and livestock. There was loud wailing throughout Egypt, as there was not a house without a death. Pharaoh urgently summoned Moses and Aaron and commanded them to leave with the Israelites, and even the Egyptians urged them to go. The Israelites requested silver, gold, and clothing from the Egyptians, and God had made the Egyptians favorably disposed to grant their request. Around 600,000 men, plus women and children, left Egypt and journeyed to Sukkoth. They brought unleavened bread, as they didn't have time to prepare food before leaving. The Israelites had lived in Egypt for 430 years, and on that very day, they left. They were commanded to keep the vigil of the Passover to honor the Lord for generations to come. God provided regulations for the Passover meal. Foreigners, temporary residents, and uncircumcised males were not allowed to partake. All the Israelites followed God's instructions, and on that day, the Lord brought them out of Egypt. Consecration of the firstborn. God instructed Moses to consecrate every firstborn male, whether human or animal, among the Israelites. This act signified that the first offspring of every womb belonged to God. Moses instructed the people to commemorate the day they came out of Egypt, the day of their liberation, by eating unleavened bread. This observance was to be a reminder of how the Lord brought them out of slavery with a mighty hand. Upon entering the Promised Land, they were to continue observing this ceremony during the month of Aviv, the month of their departure from Egypt. For 7 days, they were to eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day, they were to hold a festival to the Lord. Yeast was to be completely removed from their households during this time. Parents were to explain the significance of this observance to their children. It was meant to serve as a sign on their hands and a symbol on their foreheads, reminding them of how the Lord delivered them from Egypt. This ordinance was to be observed year after year as a testament to God's mighty hand in their history. God also commanded the Israelites to give him the firstborn of every womb, both human and animal. The firstborn males of their livestock were to be consecrated to the Lord. For unclean animals like donkeys, the firstborn was to be redeemed with a lamb, or if not, its neck was to be broken. Even their firstborn sons were to be redeemed. When future generations asked about the significance of these practices, the Israelites were to explain that God's mighty hand had brought them out of Egypt. It was a testimony of how the Lord had spared the firstborn of Israel while striking down the firstborn of Egypt. Crossing the sea. After Pharaoh let the Israelites go, God did not lead them on the shortest route through Philistine territory, fearing that they might turn back if faced with war. Instead, God led them around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites left Egypt prepared for battle. Moses took Joseph's bones with him, as Joseph had foretold that God would come to their aid, and they must carry his bones out of Egypt. As the Israelites journeyed, the Lord provided guidance and protection. During the day, a pillar of cloud went ahead of them, and at night, a pillar of fire provided light. These miraculous signs guided the Israelites day and night, and the pillars did not leave their place in front of the people. After the Israelites had left Egypt, God instructed Moses to lead them to encamp near Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, directly opposite Baal-zephon. This location seemed to be a confusing move to Pharaoh, leading him to believe that the Israelites were wandering around in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. God's purpose was to harden Pharaoh's heart again, prompting him to pursue the Israelites. Through this, God intended to gain glory for himself and demonstrate his power to both the Egyptians and the Israelites. Upon learning that the Israelites had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds and decided to pursue them. Pharaoh took 600 of the best chariots along with his army and set out after the Israelites. The Lord further hardened Pharaoh's heart, and the Egyptians pursued the Israelites as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth. When the Israelites saw the approaching Egyptian army, they were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They accused Moses of bringing them to the desert to die, expressing their desire to have remained in Egypt as slaves. Moses reassured the people not to be afraid and told them to stand firm, for they would witness the deliverance of the Lord. He urged them to be still, as the Lord himself would fight for them. God then spoke to Moses, instructing him to tell the Israelites to move on. He commanded Moses to raise his staff and stretch out his hand over the sea. When Moses did so, the Lord caused a strong east wind to blow all night, driving the waters of the sea back and creating a dry path through the midst of the sea. The pillar of cloud that had been leading the Israelites moved from in front of them to stand behind them, separating the Egyptian army from the Israelites. Throughout the night, the cloud provided light to the Israelites while bringing darkness to the Egyptians, preventing them from approaching each other. As dawn broke, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea once again. The waters, which had been divided, now returned to their place, covering the Egyptian army. The Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground, with walls of water on their right and left. Meanwhile, the Egyptians pursued them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud and caused confusion in the Egyptian army. He disrupted the wheels of their chariots, making it difficult for them to continue. The Egyptians realized that the Lord was fighting for the Israelites against them. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea once more, and the waters flowed back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. At daybreak, the sea returned to its place, and the entire Egyptian army was swept away by the waters. Not a single Egyptian survived. The Israelites witnessed this miraculous event and saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians. As a result, they feared the Lord and placed their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. This marked the culmination of their escape from Egypt and the beginning of their journey towards the Promised Land. The Song of Moses and Miriam. After the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea, Moses and the Israelites rejoiced and sang a song of praise to the Lord. This song, often referred to as the Song of Moses, celebrates God's deliverance and the defeat of the Egyptian army in the sea. The song is a powerful expression of gratitude, acknowledging God's strength, salvation, and majesty. The song begins with Moses proclaiming that he will sing to the Lord because he is highly exalted. The destruction of Pharaoh's army, both horse and driver, in the sea is seen as an act of God's power and justice. Moses declares that the Lord is his strength, defense, and salvation. He exalts God as his God and and praises him for his might. The Lord is described as a warrior, and the defeat of Pharaoh's chariots and army is highlighted. The song emphasizes how the enemy's boastful plans to pursue and destroy the Israelites were thwarted by God's intervention. The imagery of God's power is vividly portrayed. The Lord's right hand is praised for its majesty and power in shattering the enemy. The song describes how God's anger consumed the adversaries, causing the waters of the sea to pile up like a wall and congeal in the midst of the sea. The enemy's boasts of pursuing and overtaking the Israelites are shown to be futile, as God's breath causes the sea to cover them, and they sink like lead in the waters. The song exalts the uniqueness and holiness of the Lord among the gods. It speaks of God's victorious acts and his role as a deliverer and protector of his people. The song reflects the awe and wonder of witnessing God's mighty deeds and acknowledges his divine attributes. The waters of Marah and Elim. After their song of praise, the Israelites, led by Moses, journeyed from the Red Sea into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled without finding water. When they finally arrived at a place called Marah, they found water, but it was bitter and undrinkable. The people grumbled against Moses because they were thirsty and could not drink the bitter water. In response, Moses cried out to the Lord for help. The Lord showed Moses a piece of wood, which he threw into the water. The water miraculously became fit to drink, providing a solution to their immediate need. At Marah, the Lord also gave the Israelites a ruling and instruction, putting them to the test. He emphasized that if they listened carefully to him, followed his commands, and did what was right in his eyes, they would be spared the diseases that had afflicted the Egyptians. The Lord identified himself as the one who heals. Continuing their journey, the Israelites arrived at Elim, where they found 12 springs and 70 palm trees. This oasis provided them with plenty of water and a place to rest. The Lord's provision of water and sustenance demonstrated his ongoing care for his people even in the midst of their desert journey. Manna and quail. After leaving Elim, the Israelites entered the desert of Sin on their journey to Mount Sinai. There, the whole community began to grumble against Moses and Aaron, expressing their dissatisfaction with their current situation. They reminisced about their time in Egypt, when they had pots of meat and plenty of food, contrasting it with their present circumstances of scarcity and hunger in the desert. In response, the Lord communicated to Moses that he would provide for the people by raining down bread from heaven. Each day, the Israelites were instructed to gather enough manna for that day's sustenance. On the 6th day, they were to gather double the amount, enough for the 6th and 7th days. Moses and Aaron conveyed the Lord's message to the people, emphasizing that their grumbling was against the Lord and not against them. The people were to come before the Lord, and as Aaron was speaking, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord assured Moses that he had heard the grumbling of the Israelites. In the evening, quail came and covered the camp, providing meat for the people. In the morning, the ground was covered with a layer of dew, and thin flakes that resembled frost appeared on the desert floor. The Israelites referred to these flakes as manna, which means, "What is it?" Moses explained to them that the manna was the bread that the Lord had provided for them to eat. He instructed them to gather an omer of manna, an ancient measurement, for each person in their tent. Those who gathered much did not have excess, and those who gathered little had enough. Moses directed them not to keep any manna until the next morning, except on the 6th day, when they were to gather enough for 2 days. However, some disregarded this instruction and kept the manna overnight, which resulted in it becoming infested with maggots and developing a foul odor. The Israelites were to gather manna for 6 days, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, they were not to gather any. Some individuals defied this command and went out on the Sabbath to collect manna, but found none. The people referred to the bread-like substance as manna. It had a white color, similar to coriander seed, and tasted like wafers made with honey. Moses was instructed by the Lord to take an omer of manna and keep it as a testimony for future generations, a reminder of God's provision during their wilderness journey. Aaron placed an omer of manna in a jar alongside the tablets of the covenant law, ensuring its preservation. The Israelites ate manna for 40 years until they reached the border of Canaan. This miraculous provision sustained them throughout their time in the desert. Note, the concept of omer and ephah are ancient measurements that were used for quantities of food. Water from the rock. After leaving the desert of Sin, the Israelites arrived at Rephidim, but they encountered a serious problem. There was no water for the people to drink. The lack of water led to frustration and quarreling among the people, who demanded water from Moses. They even questioned why they had been brought out of Egypt if they were going to die of thirst in the desert. Moses, feeling the pressure of the situation, cried out to the Lord for guidance on how to address the people's needs. In response, God instructed Moses to gather some of the elders of Israel and to take his staff, the same one he had used to strike the Nile during the plagues in Egypt. God told Moses to go to a specific rock at Horeb and strike it, assuring him that water would come out of the rock for the people to drink. Moses followed God's instructions, and as he struck the rock, water gushed forth in the sight of the elders of Israel. The place was named Massah and Meribah, commemorating the people's quarreling and testing of the Lord, questioning whether he was truly among them. The Amalekites defeated. While the Israelites were at Rephidim, the Amalekites attacked them. Moses instructed Joshua to select some men and engage in battle with the Amalekites, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur climbed to the top of a hill. Moses held the staff of God in his hands as he stood on the hill, and as long as his hands were raised, the Israelites were winning the battle. However, when his hands grew tired and he lowered them, the Amalekites gained the upper hand. To ensure Moses could keep his hands raised, Aaron and Hur provided support. They found a stone for Moses to sit on, and they held his hands up, one on each side, until sunset. With their assistance, Joshua and the Israelites were able to overcome the Amalekite army with the sword. Following the victory, the Lord instructed Moses to write down the account of the battle and its outcome, ensuring that Joshua would hear about it. God emphasized that he would utterly blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. In response to the victory and God's help, Moses built an altar and named it, "The Lord is my banner." He recognized that the battle was not just physical but spiritual, as hands had been lifted up against the throne of the Lord. Moses proclaimed that the Lord would continue to be at war against the Amalekites for generations to come. Jethro visits Moses. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law and the priest of Midian, heard about all the remarkable things that God had done for Moses and the Israelites, including their liberation from Egypt. He decided to visit Moses in the wilderness, where the Israelites were camped near the mountain of God. Moses had sent his wife Zipporah and their 2 sons back to Jethro before, likely due to the challenging circumstances and journey the Israelites were facing. Jethro brought Zipporah and the boys to Moses, and they had a joyful reunion. The names of their sons, Gershom and Eliezer, reflected significant events in Moses' life. Upon meeting, Moses and Jethro greeted each other warmly, and Moses shared with Jethro the details of how the Lord had intervened on behalf of the Israelites, including the trials they had faced and how God had saved them from the Egyptians. Jethro was genuinely glad to hear about the Lord's acts of deliverance and praised God for his mighty deeds. Jethro's admiration for the Lord's power and compassion led him to acknowledge the greatness of the Lord compared to other gods. He offered a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God, and he, along with Aaron and the elders of Israel, shared a meal in the presence of God to celebrate and give thanks. The following day, Moses resumed his role as judge for the people. He sat to listen to and settle disputes among the Israelites from morning until evening. Observing this, Jethro questioned Moses about his approach and the strain it placed on him. Jethro advised Moses to delegate some of his responsibilities to capable men, selecting individuals who feared God, were trustworthy and had integrity. Jethro recommended that Moses establish a hierarchical system of judges, appointing officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. These officials would handle simpler cases, while more complex matters would be brought to Moses. Jethro emphasized that this approach would lighten Moses' burden and prevent burnout. Moses accepted Jethro's counsel and implemented the system of judges. By delegating authority and sharing the responsibilities of judgment, Moses could better manage the demands of leadership. He chose capable individuals to serve as leaders over different groups, and these leaders became judges, overseeing disputes and making decisions for their respective groups. After putting Jethro's advice into practice, Moses saw the effectiveness of the system. The challenging cases were brought to him, while the simpler cases were resolved by the appointed leaders. This arrangement not only eased Moses' workload, but also ensured a more efficient and just distribution of leadership responsibilities. With his mission accomplished, Jethro returned to his own country, having played a crucial role in improving the organizational structure of leadership among the Israelites. At Mount Sinai. After their journey through the wilderness, the Israelites arrived at the desert of Sinai on the first day of the third month since leaving Egypt. They set up camp in front of the mountain. Moses went up the mountain to meet with God, and the Lord spoke to him, instructing him to convey a message to the descendants of Jacob and the people of Israel. God reminded the Israelites of his deliverance from Egypt and how he had carried them on eagle's wings to bring them to himself. He presented a covenant. If they obeyed him fully and kept his commandments, they would become his treasured possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Moses was to relay these words to the Israelites. Moses returned to the people and gathered the elders to present the Lord's message. The people responded with a unanimous commitment, declaring their willingness to follow God's commands. Moses conveyed their answer back to the Lord. The Lord informed Moses that he would descend in a dense cloud so that the people could hear him speaking with Moses, leading them to trust Moses as his representative. Moses reported this to the Lord. God instructed Moses to consecrate the people by having them wash their clothes and prepare for the third day. On that day, God would descend upon Mount Sinai in full view of the people. Moses was to set boundaries around the mountain, warning the people not to approach it or even touch its base. Anyone who did so would face death, either by stoning or arrows, except when a long blast of the ram's horn signaled permission to approach. After Moses came down from the mountain, he consecrated the people, and they washed their clothes. He instructed them to abstain from sexual relations in preparation for the third day. On the morning of the third day, thunder, lightning, a thick cloud, and a loud trumpet blast filled the air. The whole camp trembled. Moses led the people out to meet with God at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was engulfed in smoke, and the mountain trembled violently as the Lord descended upon it in fire. The sound of the trumpet grew louder as Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. God called Moses to the top of Mount Sinai, and Moses ascended. However, God warned Moses to go back down and warn the people not to force their way through to see him, as many would perish. Even the priests were instructed to consecrate themselves before approaching, lest the Lord's wrath be unleashed. Moses reminded God that he had already established limits around the mountain to ensure its sanctity. God agreed and instructed Moses to bring Aaron up the mountain, but the people and the priests were not to force their way up. Moses descended from the mountain and relayed God's instructions to the people. The Israelites were in the presence of a powerful and awe-inspiring manifestation of God's presence, preparing them for the significant events and revelations that would unfold at Mount Sinai. The Ten Commandments. God spoke to the Israelites and delivered the Ten Commandments, a set of foundational moral and ethical principles that would guide their lives and their relationship with Him. These commandments were given to Moses on Mount Sinai and were intended to shape the Israelites' behavior as they formed a covenant with God. no other gods. God identified himself as the Lord who brought them out of Egypt and instructed them to have no other gods before him. They were to worship him alone, no idols. The Israelites were prohibited from making any images or idols for worship. God emphasized that he is a jealous God and will punish idolatry, but show love to those who love and obey him. Respect for God's name. Misusing God's name was forbidden, as God would not hold anyone guiltless who misused his name. Observing the Sabbath, the Israelites were commanded to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. They were to rest on the seventh day, just as God had rested after creating the world in 6 days. Honoring parents. The command to honor one's father and mother was given, promising a long life in the land that God was giving them. No murder. Murder was strictly forbidden. No adultery. Committing adultery was prohibited. No stealing. Stealing was not allowed. No false testimony. Bearing false witness against one's neighbor was prohibited. No coveting. The Israelites were told not to covet their neighbor's belongings, such as their house, wife, servants, or possessions. The giving of the 10 Commandments was a powerful and awe-inspiring event. The people witnessed thunder, lightning, the sound of a trumpet, and the mountain covered in smoke. This manifestation of God's presence filled them with fear, and they asked Moses to speak to them on God's behalf to avoid dying from the intensity of the experience. Moses reassured the people that God had come to test them and instill a healthy fear of him to deter them from sinning. Despite their fear, they were meant to understand the importance of following these commandments. God emphasized to Moses that the people should not make any gods alongside him, neither of silver nor gold. He instructed them to make altars for offerings out of earth or uncut stones, avoiding the use of tools. Moreover, God warned against building altars with steps to prevent exposing their private parts. This signaled the significance of worshiping God in a respectful and reverent manner. Laws and regulations. After delivering the 10 Commandments, God provided Moses with a series of laws and regulations that would govern various aspects of daily life and societal interactions among the Israelites. These laws covered topics such as the treatment of Hebrew servants, personal injuries, and matters related to property and animals. These laws were designed to promote justice, fairness, and social order among the people. Hebrew servants. If a Hebrew became a servant, they were to serve for 6 years, and in the 7th year, they were to be set free without payment. If they chose to remain in service due to their attachment to their master, their ear was to be pierced, and they would serve for life. Rules were established for female servants as well, ensuring their well-being and rights. Personal injuries. Different penalties were established for causing harm intentionally or accidentally. Those who intentionally killed someone were to be put to death, but if the killing was accidental and not deliberate, the offender could flee to a designated city of refuge. Similar laws were established for those who attacked their parents or kidnapped someone. Respect and responsibilities. The laws emphasized respecting and honoring parents, forbidding curses against parents, and addressing situations where someone physically harmed another person. These laws sought to promote family harmony and discourage violence. Slavery and injury. Rules were set for the treatment of slaves. Owners who caused serious injuries to their slaves were required to set them free as compensation for their injuries. If an owner struck a slave's eye or knocked out a tooth, the slave was to be freed. Animals and property. Laws were established to address scenarios involving animals. Owners were held accountable if their bulls gored and killed a person. In cases of an uncovered pit causing injury or death to animals, compensation was required. If an animal injured another animal, compensation was to be given. These laws aimed to establish a just and equitable society among the Israelites. They covered a wide range of situations and provided guidelines for resolving conflicts and disputes while promoting the well-being of individuals and the community. The laws highlighted the principles of accountability, restitution, and fairness, reinforcing the importance of respecting the rights and lives of others. Protection of property and social responsibility. The laws provided in this section address various situations involving theft, property damage, and social responsibilities. These laws aim to ensure fairness, accountability, and ethical conduct among the Israelites in their interactions with one another. Restitution for theft. Individuals who stole livestock were required to pay back the stolen animals with interest. If the stolen animal was found alive in their possession, they had to repay double. Additionally, if someone's livestock strayed into another person's field, the offender had to make restitution with the best of their own field or vineyard. Responsibility for accidents. Individuals responsible for accidental fires or damages were required to make restitution. For instance, if a fire spread and caused damage to another's property, the person responsible had to compensate for the loss. Safekeeping of property. Those who were entrusted with someone else's property and experienced theft were required to pay back double to the owner. If the owner of the stolen property could not be identified, the matter would be brought before judges to determine responsibility. Borrowed or hired property. Laws were established for cases involving borrowed or hired animals. If an animal was injured or died while in the care of the borrower or hirer, restitution was required. However, if the owner was present when the incident occurred, the borrower was not liable. Social responsibility. The laws emphasized social responsibility and ethical behavior. The Israelites were instructed not to mistreat or oppress foreigners, as they had themselves been foreigners in Egypt. They were also commanded not to take advantage of widows or orphans. Mistreatment of vulnerable members of society would result in divine retribution. Ethical conduct. Laws were established to discourage immoral behavior, including sorcery, bestiality, and idolatry. Sacrificing to gods other than the Lord was strictly prohibited. Compassion and generosity. The laws emphasized compassion and generosity. Lending money to those in need was encouraged, without charging interest. Taking a neighbor's cloak as collateral was allowed, but it had to be returned by sunset to ensure they had proper cover for the night. The laws highlighted the importance of responding to the cries of those in need. Respect and obedience. The laws emphasized respect for God and authority figures. Blaspheming God or cursing rulers was forbidden. Offerings and firstborns. The Israelites were commanded not to withhold offerings from their granaries or vats. They were also instructed to dedicate their firstborn sons and animals to the Lord. These laws focused on creating a just and compassionate society where individuals took responsibility for their actions and treated others with fairness and respect. They promoted social harmony, ethical behavior, and a sense of shared responsibility within the community. Laws of justice, mercy, and divine promises. In this section, God continues to provide the Israelites with laws and guidelines for righteous living, social responsibility, and worship. These laws emphasize justice, compassion, and faithfulness to God's covenant. False reports and justice. The Israelites were commanded not to spread false reports or be malicious witnesses. They were to avoid following the crowd in doing wrong and not pervert justice in lawsuits. Favoritism toward the poor or the rich was not to be shown in legal matters. Compassion and kindness. The laws instructed the Israelites to return their enemies' lost livestock and to assist animals in distress, even if they belonged to those who hated them. Justice for the poor in lawsuits was mandated, and false charges leading to the death of an innocent person were forbidden. Bribery and oppression. Accepting bribes was strictly prohibited, as they could blind the discernment of justice. Foreigners were to be treated fairly, as the Israelites themselves had experienced oppression as foreigners in Egypt. Sabbath laws. The Israelites were reminded of the importance of observing the Sabbath, allowing the land to rest every seventh year, and honoring the day of rest for both people and animals. Worship and celebrations. God instructed the Israelites to celebrate 3 annual festivals: the festival of unleavened bread, the festival of harvest, Pentecost, and the festival of ingathering, Tabernacles. These celebrations were occasions to bring offerings to God and commemorate their history. Angels' protection and divine promises. God promised to send an angel ahead of the Israelites to guard and guide them to the land he had prepared. The people were instructed to listen to and obey the angel's guidance. God's name was in the angel, and rebellion against him would not be tolerated. Conquest of the land. God assured the Israelites that he would lead them into the promised land, defeating the nations that inhabited it. They were warned against making covenants with the inhabitants or adopting their practices, as these could lead to spiritual downfall. Divine protection and blessings. God promised to drive out the enemies little by little and establish the borders of the Israelites' territory. They were not to fear, as God's terror would be ahead of them and their enemies would be thrown into confusion. God would bless them with food, water, health, and fertility. Covenant warnings. The Israelites were warned not to make covenants with the inhabitants of the land or worship their gods. Such actions could lead to sin and separation from God. These laws and promises emphasized the importance of justice, mercy, and faithfulness to God's guidance. They also outlined the Israelites' responsibilities in their relationships with God, their fellow humans, and the land they were entering. A confirmation of the covenant and Moses' ascent. In this section, the covenant between God and the Israelites is formalized through a ceremony involving Moses, the elders, and the people. The covenant's terms are agreed upon, and Moses ascends Mount Sinai to receive the tablets of the law. Preparation for the covenant. God instructs Moses, along with Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel, to approach him on the mountain. Only Moses is to come near, and the people are not permitted to join them. Reading of the covenant. Moses shares the words and laws of God with the people, and they unanimously commit to obeying everything that the Lord has spoken. Moses writes down these words. Covenant offering. Early the next morning, Moses builds an altar and sets up 12 stone pillars, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Young Israelite men offer burnt offerings and sacrifices. Moses takes the blood of the offerings, splashes it on the altar, and places some of it in bowls. Reading and acceptance of the covenant. Moses reads the book of the covenant to the people, and they again express their willingness to follow God's commands. He sprinkles the blood on the people, symbolizing their participation in the covenant. Covenant ratification. Moses, along with Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 elders, goes up the mountain. There they experience a unique encounter with God. They see a vision of God's presence, represented by a pavement of lapis lazuli under his feet, resembling the sky's brilliant blue. These leaders of Israel are able to see God and even share a meal in his presence without harm. God's instruction to Moses. God invites Moses to come up the mountain and remain there. God promises to give Moses the tablets of stone containing the law and commandments for the people's instruction. Moses' ascent. Moses, accompanied by his aide Joshua, ascends the mountain of God. Before departing, Moses instructs the elders to wait for his return and to seek the guidance of Aaron and Hur in his absence. God's manifestation. As Moses ascends the mountain, a cloud covers it, and the glory of the Lord settles on Mount Sinai. The cloud remains for 6 days, and on the 7th day, God calls out to Moses from within the cloud. Divine presence. To the Israelites, the glory of the Lord appears like a consuming fire atop the mountain. Moses enters the cloud and continues to ascend the mountain, where he remains for 40 days and 40 nights. This section emphasizes the seriousness and sacredness of the covenant between God and the Israelites. The people's commitment is sealed with blood, and Moses' intimate encounter with God on the mountain foreshadows the revelation of the law and commandments that will shape their lives and relationship with God. Instructions for the tabernacle and its furnishings. In this section, God provides detailed instructions to Moses for constructing the tabernacle, a sacred tent where God's presence will dwell among the Israelites. The passage outlines the materials, dimensions, and design for the Ark of the Covenant, the table for the bread of the presence, and the lampstand. The Ark of the Covenant. Moses is instructed to make an ark, a chest, of acacia wood. The dimensions are specified: 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. The ark is to be overlaid with pure gold, both inside and out. 4 gold rings are to be attached to the corners, and poles of acacia wood overlaid with gold are to be inserted through the rings for carrying. The tablets of the covenant law that God will give to Moses are to be placed inside the ark. An atonement cover, mercy seat, of pure gold is to be made, with 2 cherubim on either end facing each other and overshadowing the cover. The presence of God will meet Moses above this cover, between the cherubim. The table for the bread of the presence. A table is to be constructed of acacia wood. The dimensions are specified: 2 cubits long, 1 cubit wide, and 1.5 cubits high. The table is to be overlaid with pure gold. A rim and a gold molding are to be added to the table. 4 gold rings are to be attached to the corners, and poles overlaid with gold are to be inserted for carrying. Plates, dishes, pitchers, and bowls for offerings are to be made of pure gold. The bread of the presence is to be placed on the table before God at all times. The lampstand, golden menorah. A lampstand of pure gold is to be created. The base, shaft, cups, buds, and blossoms are to be hammered out of 1 piece of gold. The lampstand is to have 6 branches extending from its sides, with 3 cups shaped like almond flowers, buds, and blossoms on each branch. There will also be 4 cups shaped like almond flowers, buds, and blossoms on the lampstand itself. 7 lamps are to be set up on the lampstand, which will be used to light the space in front of it. Wick trimmers and trays are to be made of pure gold, materials and craftsmanship. The instructions emphasize the use of pure gold, acacia wood, and skilled craftsmanship in constructing these sacred items. Moses is instructed to follow the precise pattern that God will show him on the mountain. These instructions demonstrate the meticulous care and reverence that God expects in the construction of the tabernacle and its furnishings. The tabernacle will serve as a central place of worship and symbolize God's presence among the Israelites during their journey through the wilderness. Construction of the tabernacle and its furnishings continued. In this section, the instructions for constructing the tabernacle and its furnishings continue. The details provided include the construction of the tabernacle's curtains, the frames, crossbars, and curtains for the entrance. Curtains and coverings. Moses is instructed to create 10 curtains for the tabernacle using finely twisted linen, blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, with cherubim woven into them by a skilled worker. All the curtains are to be the same size, 28 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. The curtains are to be joined together in 2 sets of 5 curtains each. Loops of blue material are to be made along the edge of the curtains, and 50 loops on one curtain are to be fastened to 50 loops on the opposite curtain using gold clasps. Curtains of goat hair are to be made for the tent that covers the tabernacle. 11 curtains are to be made, each 30 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. These curtains are to be joined together and fastened with bronze clasps. An additional length of 1/2 cubit is to hang down at the rear of the tabernacle, covering it. A covering of ram skins dyed red and another covering of durable leather are to be placed over the tent curtains. Upright frames and crossbars. Moses is instructed to make upright frames of acacia wood for the tabernacle. Each frame is to be 10 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide. Projections are to be set parallel to each other on the frames. 20 frames are to be made for the south side and 20 for the north side of the tabernacle, with 40 silver bases. 6 frames are to be made for the west end, along with 2 frames for the corners. Crossbars of acacia wood are to be made and overlaid with gold, with 5 crossbars for each side of the tabernacle. Placement of furnishings. The center crossbar is to extend from end to end at the middle of the frames. The frames and crossbars are to be overlaid with gold and fitted with gold rings. The tabernacle is to be set up according to the plan shown to Moses on the mountain. A curtain made of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn and finely twisted linen is to be hung with gold hooks on 4 acacia wood posts, overlaid with gold and standing on 4 silver bases. The curtain will separate the holy place from the most holy place, behind which the Ark of the Covenant Law will be placed. The atonement cover is to be put on the Ark in the most holy place. The table is to be placed outside the curtain on the north side, and the lampstand is to be placed opposite it on the south side. Curtain for the entrance. Moses is instructed to create a curtain for the entrance to the tent using blue, purple, and scarlet yarn and finely twisted linen, the work of an embroiderer. Gold hooks are to be made for this curtain, and 5 acacia wood posts overlaid with gold are to be used, along with bronze bases. These detailed instructions ensure that the construction of the tabernacle and its furnishings adheres to a specific design and pattern. The curtains, frames, and other components are constructed with the utmost precision and reverence, symbolizing the sacredness of the place where God's presence will reside among the Israelites. Completion of tabernacle and instructions for the courtyard. In this section, the instructions for completing the construction of the tabernacle, including the altar of burnt offering, the courtyard, and the provision of oil for the lampstand, are provided. Altar of burnt offering. The altar of burnt offering is to be constructed using acacia wood. The altar should be 3 cubits high and 5 cubits long and wide, making it square. A horn is to be made at each of the 4 corners, and the altar and horns are to be of one piece, overlaid with bronze. All the utensils for the altar, such as pots, shovels, sprinkling bowls, meat forks, and fire pans, are to be made of bronze. A grating of bronze network is to be made, with a bronze ring at each corner. Poles of acacia wood, overlaid with bronze, are to be inserted into rings for carrying. The altar is to be hollow, made from boards, following the design shown on the mountain. Courtyard. A courtyard is to be constructed around the tabernacle. The south side of the courtyard is to be 100 cubits long, with finely twisted linen curtains, 20 posts, and 20 bronze bases. The north side is to be identical in size and construction to the south side. The west end of the courtyard is to be 50 cubits wide, with curtains, 10 posts, and 10 bases. The east end is to mirror the west end in size and construction. The entrance to the courtyard is to have a curtain of 20 cubits, made of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn and finely twisted linen, with 4 posts and 4 bases. All the posts around the courtyard are to have silver bands and hooks and bronze bases. The courtyard is to have curtains of finely twisted linen, 5 cubits high, and bronze bases. Oil for the lampstand. The Israelites are commanded to provide clear oil of pressed olives for the lampstand to keep the lamps burning. Aaron and his sons are instructed to keep the lamps burning before the Lord from evening till morning in the tent of meeting, outside the curtain that shields the Ark of the Covenant Law. This practice is to be a lasting ordinance among the Israelites for generations to come. The completion of the construction of the tabernacle and its surrounding courtyard marks the preparation for the establishment of the sacred space where the Israelites will worship and commune with God. The details provided in these instructions highlight the care and precision required to create a space that is conducive to encountering the divine presence. Priestly garments and ordination. In this section, detailed instructions are given for crafting the sacred garments for Aaron and his sons, who are to serve as priests. These garments are meant to symbolize their consecration and represent their roles as mediators between the Israelites and God. Sacred garments for Aaron. The skilled workers are instructed to make sacred garments for Aaron, which will give him dignity and honor. These garments include a breastpiece, an ephod, a robe, a woven tunic, a turban, and a sash. The materials to be used are gold, blue, purple, scarlet yarn, and fine linen. The ephod. The ephod is to be made of gold, blue, purple, scarlet yarn, and finely twisted linen crafted by skilled hands. It is to have 2 shoulder pieces attached to 2 corners with a skillfully woven waistband of the same materials. Memorial stones on the ephod. 2 onyx stones are to be engraved with the names of the sons of Israel, representing the 12 tribes, and attached to the ephod. These stones will serve as memorial stones before the Lord, and Aaron will bear them on his shoulders. Breastpiece for decisions. A breastpiece is to be fashioned with skilled work similar to the ephod, using gold, blue, purple, scarlet yarn, and finely twisted linen. 4 rows of precious stones are to be mounted on the breastpiece, each stone representing a tribe of Israel. The breastpiece is to be worn by Aaron over his heart and will contain the Urim and Thummim, enabling him to make decisions for the Israelites before the Lord. Other priestly garments. A robe of blue cloth with an opening for the head and a woven edge is to be made. Pomegranates of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, along with gold bells, are to alternate around the hem of the robe. A plate of pure gold with the engraving, "Holy to the Lord," is to be attached to Aaron's turban using a blue cord. Aaron is to wear the robe and the plate on his forehead when ministering, symbolizing his consecration and acceptance of the sacred gifts offered by the Israelites. Ordination and undergarments. Aaron and his sons are to be anointed and ordained after donning these sacred garments. Linen undergarments are to be worn by Aaron and his sons whenever they enter the tent of meeting or approach the altar to prevent them from incurring guilt and dying. The intricate details of the priestly garments and their symbolism reflect the importance of the priesthood in mediating between God and the people. These garments visually communicate the priestly role, the consecration of the priests, and their unique responsibilities in the worship and service of God. Consecration of the priests. In this section, instructions are given for the consecration of Aaron and his sons as priests. The process involves various sacrifices, offerings, anointing, and rituals to prepare them for their sacred role. Offerings and preparations. Aaron and his sons are to be consecrated by taking a young bull and 2 rams without defect. Various types of unleavened bread are prepared, along with the sacrificial animals, and placed in a basket. Cleansing and dressing. Aaron and his sons are brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting and washed with water. Aaron is dressed with the sacred garments, including the tunic, robe of the ephod itself, the breastpiece, and the turban with the sacred emblem. The anointing oil is poured on Aaron's head to consecrate him. Ordination process. Aaron's sons are also dressed in tunics, caps, and sashes as part of the ordination process. The bull is brought forward, and Aaron and his sons lay their hands on its head, symbolizing the transfer of their sins to the animal. The bull is slaughtered, and its blood is applied to the horns of the altar and poured out at the base. The fat and specific internal organs are burned on the altar, while the rest of the bull is burned outside the camp. Sacrifices and consecration. Similar rituals are performed with one of the rams, with its blood splashed on the sides of the altar, and the ram's flesh offered as a burnt offering. The other ram's blood is applied to Aaron and his sons' right ears, right thumbs, and right big toes, consecrating them. Blood from the altar and anointing oil is sprinkled on Aaron and his sons, as well as their garments, to consecrate them. Wave offerings and sharing. Specific portions of the ordination ram are waved before the Lord as a wave offering, representing a portion shared with God. Consecrated portions belonging to Aaron and his sons are designated. 7 days of ordination. Aaron's sacred garments are passed down to his descendants for future generations. The ordained priests wear these garments for 7 days when serving in the holy place. Burnt offerings and consecration. Each day, a bull is sacrificed as a sin offering, purifying and consecrating the altar. Regular offerings are specified: 2 lambs a year old, 1 in the morning and 1 at twilight, accompanied by flour, oil, and wine offerings. Continual worship. The burnt offering is to be performed regularly at the entrance to the tent of meeting, where God will meet with the people and consecrate the place by his glory. Dwelling among the Israelites. Through the consecration of the priests and the establishment of the tabernacle rituals, God signifies his presence among the Israelites. The ultimate purpose of this consecration is to have God dwell among his people, and they will recognize him as the Lord who brought them out of Egypt. These instructions detail the process by which Aaron and his sons are consecrated as priests, allowing them to mediate on behalf of the Israelites and facilitating their communion with God. The rituals emphasize the sanctity of their role and the importance of proper worship practices in maintaining a holy relationship with the divine. Continuation of the instructions. In this portion, instructions are given regarding the construction of the altar of incense, the atonement money, the bronze basin for washing, the anointing oil, and the composition of incense. The altar of incense. A square altar of acacia wood is to be made for burning incense, overlaid with pure gold. 2 gold rings are attached to it for carrying with acacia wood poles overlaid with gold. The altar is to be placed in front of the curtain before the Ark of the Covenant, where God will meet with Moses and Aaron. Aaron is to burn fragrant incense on this altar every morning and evening as part of the regular worship. Annual atonement and sanctity. Once a year, Aaron is to make atonement on the horns of the incense altar with the blood of the atoning sin offering. The incense altar is declared most holy to the Lord, and no other offerings are to be presented on it. Atonement money. When taking a census of the Israelites, each individual is to give a half shekel as an offering to the Lord to atone for their lives. This is done to prevent a plague during the counting. The atonement money collected is to be used for the service of the tent of meeting and serves as a memorial and atonement for the lives of the Israelites. Bronze basin for washing. A bronze basin and its stand are to be constructed for washing. Aaron and his sons are to wash their hands and feet from it whenever they enter the tent of meeting or approach the altar to present offerings. This is to ensure their purity and prevent their death. Anointing oil. Specific ingredients are provided for making a sacred anointing oil, including myrrh, fragrant cinnamon, fragrant calamus, cassia, and olive oil. This oil is to be used to consecrate the tent of meeting, the ark, the table, the lampstand, the altars, and the basin. Aaron and his sons are anointed with this oil to consecrate them as priests. Rules for the anointing oil. The anointing oil is declared sacred and is not to be poured on anyone else or made using the same formula. Using a similar formula or making a similar oil will result in being cut off from the community. Composition of incense. A fragrant blend of spices including gum resin, onycha, galbanum, and pure frankincense is to be used to make incense. This incense is to be salted, pure, and sacred. A portion of the incense is to be ground into powder and placed in front of the Ark of the Covenant, where God will meet with Moses. Sanctity of the incense. The formula for making this specific incense is to be used only for sacred purposes in the tent of meeting. Making incense using the same formula for personal enjoyment will result in being cut off from the community. These instructions emphasize the sanctity of the items used in worship, the consecration of Aaron and his sons as priests, and the need for ritual purity in approaching God. The atonement money serves as a reminder of the cost of life and the sacredness of worship. The anointing oil and the incense symbolize the presence of God and His holiness in the midst of the Israelite community. Continuation of the instructions. Bezalel and Oholiab. God informs Moses that He has chosen Bezalel, a skilled craftsman from the tribe of Judah, to be filled with the Spirit of God, wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and all kinds of craftsmanship. Bezalel is appointed to create artistic designs in gold, silver, bronze, stone cutting, woodwork, and various crafts. Oholiab, from the tribe of Dan, is appointed to assist Bezalel. God grants wisdom and skill to all the skilled workers who will be involved in constructing the tabernacle and its furnishings. Completion of the tabernacle. God instructs that the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, the atonement cover, all the furnishings, the sacred garments for the priests, anointing oil, and fragrant incense are to be made exactly as God commanded. Observance of the Sabbath. God speaks to Moses, emphasizing the importance of observing the Sabbaths. Observing the Sabbath is a sign between God and the Israelites for generations to come, demonstrating that He is the one who sanctifies them. The Sabbath is to be kept holy. Anyone who desecrates it or works on that day will be cut off from the community. The Israelites are to celebrate the Sabbath as a lasting covenant, as a memorial to God's creation of the heavens and the earth in 6 days, followed by His rest on the 7th day. Tablets of the Covenant Law. The passage concludes with God giving Moses the 2 tablets of the Covenant Law on Mount Sinai. These tablets are inscribed by the finger of God, containing the commandments and laws that will guide the people's lives and their relationship with God. These instructions emphasize the importance of skilled craftsmanship, the significance of the Sabbath as a holy day of rest and covenant, and the formal transfer of the covenant law to Moses through the tablets. The skilled artisans are entrusted with the responsibility of creating the intricate items needed for worship, while the observance of the Sabbath remains a cornerstone of Israelite life. And so, the first part of the incredible journey of Moses comes to a close. The tale of his life is one of trials and triumphs, of obedience and rebellion, of a people chosen by God to fulfill a remarkable destiny. From his miraculous rescue as an infant to his courageous stand against a mighty Pharaoh, Moses' story is a testament to the power of faith and the providence of a loving Creator. If you've been captivated by this episode of Divine Bible Stories, don't miss out on the rest of Moses' incredible journey. There are still miracles to witness, lessons to learn, and an unbreakable bond between God and His people to explore. Remember, the journey continues with even more remarkable stories from the Bible. To stay connected and be the first to know about new content, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Divine Bible Stories. Your support fuels our passion to bring these ancient narratives to life. Thank you for joining us on this divine journey. Until next time, may you find inspiration, wisdom, and hope in the timeless stories of the Bible. Shalom, and see you in the next part of Moses' extraordinary adventure.